All right, I'm really glad to be back with you. Happy January. We've got 4 of these events coming up over this semester. We'll do one a month. So this one, we're talking about a really interesting topic about resource access and equity and scarcity issues. I sort of focused this because of one of your suggestions on water scarcity, but we could talk about resource equity and access and ethics more generally. So there's a lot that we could talk about. We're going to give it a solid hour and see where we end up, and then we can continue the conversations. I will say that this has been really exciting to me, and Dr. Kubler, our associate director, is here with us. Thanks for being here. I'm really, really glad for all of you joining us, because these conversations have turned into research experiences and teaching demonstrations. And as Sterling well knows, having been around for a while now, there's lots of really interesting things that can come out of good discussions. So we're going to talk today about water rights and ethical access to resources. And I can start us off with a sort of overview from my perspective, but if anybody wants to jump in at any time, this is going to be driven by you, my hope is. When I think about questions of resources and rights and resources, I guess, to summarize the title, I kind of think about 2 perspectives. So one, an original model, and this dates back to the 1960s in the US, 1970s, about consumption. So patterns of consumption that lead to limited resources, and questions of access and equity and justice and autonomy and harms and all of the ethics stuff that goes with it. But there's another side of that coin, which is why I offered you the podcast, and that is overabundance. So at the same time, when some groups of us, or some individuals even, face lack of access, other people face access as a burden, like an overabundance. And these 2 things are mirrored by lots of various factors, but those are 2 perspectives. The consumption and resources story is, like I said, relatively, it's been around for a long time in the US context, and there's been some really good work done on it. And so I'll just introduce you to one of these concepts. Many of you will know this already, and that's the tragedy of the commons. So back in in 1968, in the publication Science, philosopher Garrett Hardin wrote this piece called Tragedy of the Commons, where he lays out what he sees as this fundamental problem of consumption. Basically, to summarize Hardin's position and his argument, he says, look, if you had a field, a commons, like a resource everybody could share, and a farmer said, hey, there's this field that everybody's sharing, I'm going to put a cow on it for grazing, right? Their neighbor might say, hey, well, I'm feeling left out, I'm going to put 2 cows on it for grazing, right? Because it's open to everybody. And that first farmer is going to say, no, wait a second, like, I'm going to put 3 cows, 2 more cows, right? And all of a sudden, there's this pattern of consumption that happens that's driven by perhaps competition, Hardin would say, and this leads to a failure, a breakdown of the commons. To stick with the metaphor, cows overgraze the field. No more cows, no more field, no more commons. It's a resource consumption model, and it's kind of pessimistic. And yet it's held a lot of sway in shaping the conversation about how we deal with resources, from water to anything else. So you might think about the difference maybe between tragedy of the commons and like a wealth of the commons, on the other hand. Steve, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Yeah, one thing about the commons, of course, is the fact that they're not consistent, they're not stable, certainly when it comes to weather, water, food, all of those things. And they change from year to year sometimes, or even sooner. And so it's difficult to plan in advance without some type of really good science behind you. Sometimes I wonder lately whether or not some of our American citizens have turned away from science, whether it be on COVID, whether it be on weather. Some of the crazy things that I hear now are just unbelievable. And then the other thing, of course, is choices people make. We just had a catastrophe over on the Gulf Coast of Florida, of course. That should have been expected, actually. In fact, it's amazing that didn't happen any sooner than it did, it's going to happen. So these are all tough choices people have to make and then plan for. We kind of rely on a safety net of some sort, like insurance, to come in and fix everything and make it right. And we're finding in Florida that doesn't always work. So I'll leave it at that and see if anybody wants to pick up that thread.
Yeah, your take, Stephen, on the idea that commons aren't stable or consistent resonated with me really strongly. Yeah, there's kind of an assumption in Garrett Hardin's piece that when we're thinking about commons, it's a fixed resource, and we could manage or fail to manage it, and it will be sustainable or not sustainable, and that doesn't seem to take change into consideration.
So I don't see anybody else's hand, so let me just add one more thing. Florida just lost a lawsuit. There were 3 states involved in a lawsuit involving water rights. Florida, the one that they lost, had to do with oyster fishing on the panhandles, and they were accusing Georgia farmers of using too much water. And this had been going on, I think, for 2 decades, if I'm not mistaken. And the idea was a certain amount of fresh water is actually needed to mix in with the salt water for the best oyster raising. And finally, after battling this lawsuit and ungodly amounts of attorney fees, it went to the Supreme Court, and Justice Amy Coney Barrett was the one that made the decision, and Florida lost the lawsuit. She said, and I think unfortunately rightfully so, it was over oystering by Florida, and they now, so it's not the water. I mean, that might have helped if they could have won that lawsuit, but they've now put a restriction for 5 years on oystering. So that's the kind of sustainability things that you have to do, I think, to bring things that you've overused back into sustainability, and whether it's water, just about anything else, where a large population uses the same resource. So just another thread to catch on.
Yeah, I love the local example. I don't think I'd read about that. I hadn't read about that court case yet. Yeah, I like the focus of the court on consumption, right? There's sort of 2 approaches to resolving tragedy of the commons. One, it's get more commons or differently manage commons, or consume less, right?
Well, that is consumption in the same sense. In other words, the water is needed for, whether it be for farming, whether it be for drinking, whether it be for bottling. All of those things involve consumption, not just, going into your refrigerator and grabbing one of those plastic bottles of water. I mean, all that's consumption that everybody needs. So,
yeah, to take that example national, in the news this morning, I was reading that California is the last of 7 states to try to reach an agreement on water treaty rights for the Colorado River, how to manage that. And basically 6 states who rely on the Colorado have agreed on a plan, but California, who has the oldest treaty rights, has said no to that plan, and they're going to come up with their own. And so here's another example on a bigger national level scale of the same sort of things. The Colorado River as a commons being overutilized. Now, why it's overutilized, I think, is an interesting point, an interesting question, and there's several possible responses there. Are there other examples that you all can think of sort of resource equity access issues? It seems like there's a litany of these.
So I have one, but in a very general sense. I'm in biology, but so I'm not an economics expert. My understanding of the current, I guess, U.S. economic models, to say it very generally, is that they mostly assume infinite resources. So we talked about the commons as a constant. In this case, the constant is essentially infinity. So these models assume that these resources are always going to be there, and whether these are climate risk models, or if they're just internal models for land use and things like that, the assumption is seemingly infinite.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Ian. It's interesting in my grad seminar this semester, which is an environmental philosophy course, we're talking a lot about the way that we get to ethical decisions. And a lot of that we've articulated in class together. A lot of that is functionally worldview. So if you take a perspective, a starting place, what philosophers would call like a metaphysical starting place, a view of the world as infinite set of resources, what you get out of that as an ethic, as an orientation of that world, heads you in a particular direction. If the ground changes, if you've got a different worldview in place, you end up then with a different ethic. At least this is the argument we've been putting forward. And it does seem like the Western world at least is stuck in this sort of worldview as you describe, a world of resources, potentially infinite resources. And yet there's obvious pushbacks. That I think this is what even in the 60s, this is what Garrett Hardin and others were critiquing. In that same era of philosophy, there were pushbacks, I don't know, against population growth, population explosion, the Ehrliches and the population bomb, 1973 or 2 or whatever that was, made this argument that really it was the size that was the problem, not necessarily even consumption patterns, but just the sheer number of consumers. Now that argument has come and gone, and maybe it's coming back, I don't know. But there's all these aspects that get us to an ethic. Yeah. I was thinking here, as I was sort of thinking about where the discussion might go, I was thinking about all of the various water stories that have been in the news in the last 5-10 years, right? From Dakota Access pipeline questions to what's going on, what went on and is going on in Flint, Michigan, and now Atlanta, sort of our major cities having infrastructure / resource questions that lead to specifically water issues. Stephen, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
So, Jonathan, yeah, if you'll allow me to share my screen, I may have something of interest that the group might appreciate. I don't know if I have access to that or not.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. Are you able to see that, the drought monitor?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. So you mentioned California. So if you take a look over here at California, you see how severe the drought is. You know, that real dark spot there. I mean, you know, and mid-southern California is the worst. Of course, all of these states in the Southwest rely on the Colorado River. So, and like you said, I heard the same thing you did this morning, that 6 of the states had finally come to a painful agreement. I mean, they all would be required to really reduce their water use. For some reason, California thinks they're special, or maybe I heard something about them being the earliest one, and they're going to come up with their own plan, but they haven't yet. One thing, though, if you take a look at the Atlantic coast states over here, including Florida, we're in pretty good shape, even though we do have droughts and fires that do happen from time to time. But there is a fear of saltwater intrusion, which I don't know if it comes under your category of water usage, but it certainly would diminish the amount of water usage. It would contaminate water that's used for farming along those areas. Other things that have happened there too, of course, is the coastal erosion. And I know, speaking of oysters, we have some UCF staff that are very much into that. In fact, I had a note on that. Linda Walters, working over the Mosquito and Indian River lagoons, really doing a job to try to protect the oysters, because not only are oysters used for eating, they also play a very prominent role in the sustainability of the coastal areas. So all of that is, I think, of great importance. So
Oh, go ahead, Stephen, please.
I was just gonna, if you have any questions about the map here, I'll leave it up for a minute and I'll take it down.
It's not really a question, but the only observation I was going to make is that we should note the date of the map, because one of the important things about this conversation is, to me at least, is rate of change. So in a short period from October 2022 through now, drought conditions in Florida are markedly different because the Rockies had one of the highest snowpacks they've had in several decades. So most of California is now in moderate drought or better in just a few short months. And that rapid change is relatively new. In fact, those patterns of change, I think, are disruptive to the way we think about resource access in a lot of ways. And I think that's really interesting. That was one thing that continues to stick with me. And it could be a function of a generational difference too, right? Maybe I haven't been around long enough to have seen those patterns of change, but it feels to me, and I think we have good scientific evidence that rates of change have increased, and that's going to put pressures on the way we do ethical evaluation around resources. Now, the conversation so far has focused us on sort of, I guess, what I might call epistemic conditions, right? So what's the state of the world? What's the state of resources that on which we need to do ethical evaluation? So the next question is, what does that ethical evaluation look like? Like, what kind of concerns are there when it comes to resources? We could stick with water, we could go bigger. It's all up to you all. Dr. Kubli, yeah, please.
Yeah, I had a question. I was hoping you could frame the discussion a little bit more, and maybe others would want to contribute. It seems to me that some distinctions can be made between situations in which the access to water is about competing values or competing stakeholders. We could maybe look at water distribution across Colorado and California or Arizona as competing interests. How much does any one state suck out of the Colorado River, for example? And they're connected because the river flows, between them or among them. But that could be maybe distinguished from, say, a Flint, Michigan situation where it's about providing services to the people, and the government there that was managing the water rights and the companies there all involved. The people are the stakeholders. So there doesn't seem to be a competition between two entities that may have directly competing values as there might be in, say, a state-to-state access, or we could even maybe find similar paradigms in nation-to-nation access for water. So I wonder, is there a clear distinction to be made there, or is it somewhat artificial?
So the distinction is between needs of particular individuals or states in this case versus collectives?
I guess, the residents of Flint, Michigan needed water. We all need water. The
Yes.
water providers were there and answerable to the public, ostensibly, and there to provide water to the public. In the case of two states through which a river flows, now the issue is really brought on by the fact that the river flows across a political border, and it happens to originate or flow first through one boundary before another. And so the issue can be, how much does one extract? There's competing values there, and they're not answerable maybe to the same authority, or I guess an authority that derives power from people. We have different groups of people. So that's to me more of a values conflict, in that we have some competing values. Flint, Michigan is more aligned. It's just about, making big mistakes that hurt the public and that were avoidable, frankly.
Yeah, I can see that. Okay, so right. Okay, I see what you're going now. Yeah. An analogy I may make between those two examples, though, is that the competition between states is maybe a macrocosm of what happens in Flint, in this way, that the residents of Flint, Michigan felt as though, and for a long time didn't have a lot of power to change the conditions of their access to water, right? Maybe they didn't know enough or have enough political clout or whatever it might be to recognize the problem and do anything about it. They were sort of bound by these power dynamics, much like these 6 states that we were talking about with California are kind of being held at hostage. Why? Well, because California has the world's 9th largest economy in terms of whatever. They produce X percentage of the United States food. It's a big percentage. I don't know the number. So they've got a lot of clout in that. The interests are competing, right? The need for water is shared by 7 states. The need for Colorado River water. Can't say that clearly. But California has this overriding power to change conditions. And so there's at least some story to be told about the way we hash out fairly a story about equitable use. And we should probably talk, maybe we can talk about ways that might play out, like theories of justice, for instance.
So I might be conflating a couple. Oh, go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, with Flint, Michigan, wasn't there a problem with their pipes? So it caused the corrosion and undesirable metals or whatever in the water. So that, I mean, it's all related, I think. There was a situation I heard on the news a few weeks ago about, I think it was Alabama, where one of the, and in fact, this showed up, I believe it was on CBS 60 Minutes, where one of the poor cities, they just hadn't kept up their water equipment, and they actually lost pumps to supply water to one of the minority towns. And it was discriminating. In other words, they had discriminated, they took care of the water resources and the water equipment in other larger towns, but this small minority town, they just put it off, and finally the pump broke down. They didn't have a replacement for it, and they were without water for quite some time. So, that's an argument too. Not only the water itself, but how to get the water to your home is another big issue.
Yeah. And Steve, I want to let you jump back in, but I just want to make sure that I'm hearing the distinction you're making as clearly as I can. There's a distinction we can make around ethical issues between engineering failures. Flint, Michigan partly was an engineering failure,
That's right.
combined with a bunch of other things, resource access, money, versus a needs conflict, right? So if Florida and Georgia both need fresh water for oysters, on Stephen's example, there's a sort of a resource conflict. Not necessarily a value conflict, because the value is the same, shared. It's just a question of how are we going to fairly divide up those resources?
That's right. And in the Southwest, from what I understand, you may own a piece of land, but you don't own the mineral rights underneath that land, nor the water rights. As a matter of fact, that's all controlled. So, these are legal issues as to how you can use the water. You have to beg for it or whatever. You have to sue or, okay, so I see Ian's got his hand up, so let me let him.
Oh, I wasn't trying to interrupt you, Stephen. I was just putting myself in the queue. So I think maybe an interesting hybrid of these two concepts is kind of what's playing out in Florida. I think there is a proposal coming to amend the Florida Constitution. I think it's going to be an amendment. And this is, I'm going to do my best here, but I think it's basically a Access to Clean Water Act type situation. And the wording suggests that action or inaction by the Florida government any action that leads to contaminating the waters in Florida, or inaction to prevent that, it outlines steps citizens can take to sue the state, which kind of gets at what we're playing at of how do we enforce these things? How do we come up with solutions? And it's definitely not an easy way. And some of the wording is anything that will harm the waterways. So there's words that have to be defined there. What is harm? What is safe water? What are the different waterways we're talking about? Where is we used the Georgia-Florida example just now. We can protect the Florida side of, I think that's with Chattahoochee River up in Apalachicola. But if Georgia is pumping a bunch of contaminants into it, there's nothing we can do about that. So I think that's going to be out on the radar in the next, probably this year. I don't know if anyone else has heard about this.
Yeah, it did. I didn't know very many details, Ian, and I just posted a link to Bay News, a local Orange County news site, on this issue. So you can let me know if that's the same one you're talking about. But that was on my radar because there are some, there's at least one postdoc who's joined us in the session before at UCF right now, who is really interested in the rights of nature movement. And some of the drivers for this constitutional amendment are trying to get the state constitution to reflect at least a moderate rights of nature approach that would protect waterways, because by recognizing the value they have then in and of themselves. This is a really interesting interface between legal approaches and moral approaches. A lot of environmental philosophy has for a long time promoted the idea that some natural entities, maybe rivers and lakes and mountains, have intrinsic value or value in and of themselves apart from our use of them. And that those views that have been around for decades now have been reflected in international law quite strongly and are starting to be reflected in the US, which is really compelling. There's a sense in which it's a legal tool that I think is being deployed to protect waterways that maybe are at, and here's a value conflict, I think, and then I'll shut up, Steve, I promise. There's a value conflict, right, between the rights of nature and nature as a resource. And the legal battle is between those two value perspectives, basically. And the nature as a resource has won out, and that's led to manatee die-offs. It's led to agricultural runoff and pollution and algae blooms in Florida. It's led to all kinds of environmental degradation. And so the legal pushback, the moral pushback, is on this rights of nature side. So I'm really interested to see where that shakes out in the courts. Yeah, Steve, and then please, Ian.
I might be taking us backward a little bit. I like the thread that we were taking toward environmental rights, but I wanted to go back a little bit to the question of how do we frame rights like access to water when it involves two separate political entities. And one of the things that I've said in this forum before is that I think a real challenge, at least our nation is facing, is that there seems to be a myopic focus on rights and not on responsibility. So to the environmental question, I might say, well, we could frame it in terms of a need to have environmental rights enshrined in Constitution and other documents. Maybe we should think of it as responsibility as well, that we have a personal responsibility to do that to sustain our country. And there was a fascinating article yesterday that I heard on NPR about an economist who's arguing to, one of the UN organizations, I don't remember which one it is, maybe it's World Bank, about how carbon taxing and carbon access should actually be almost reframed in terms of value that natural resources have. Things like ocean grasses, or I don't remember, seagrass, which is one of the major carbon capture resources. And so perhaps countries ought to be paid actually a carbon credit for cultivating and sustaining seagrass rather than plowing it under. The carbon capture capability of seagrass apparently vastly outweighs by like a factor of 5 to 1 the Amazon forest. So I'm interested in this whole shift from rights to responsibility. So with that preamble, bear with me. My point here is we can talk about the need for California to have water, and I completely believe in it. You know, I love my salads at night, appreciate the bread basket out there for the country. But where is there an issue of responsibility? Can California, shift its economy as it has over time to be very strongly agricultural in an area where there is not sufficient water, similar as Arizona has done, and then cry for a need without actually acting on responsibility to provide their own resources? And extrapolating, can Missouri, well, I'm not sure if that's a great example, but can Missouri claim to Texas, you've got oil wealth, well, we have energy needs too, so you must provide us with energy? Do these questions only come up because the river flows through two states? What responsibility does any entity have in governing its overall need? There, I'm done, if you can believe it.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, you have raised this before, Dr. Kubler, and I really appreciate it, because one story that we might tell is that what's happened is through the rights legal approach, so rights of rivers, rights of waterways, is we've skipped responsibility for the sake of accountability. Right. So if we have a legal framework that encodes rights, say in the Florida State Constitution, what then falls out of that are legal recourses for infringing on those rights. That's the accountability story. Some external entity gets to sue or whatever, right? But in between that, in the traditional story, it goes rights, which then lead to a reflection with responsibility. So if you recognize something has rights, it cultivates in you, a sense of responsibility towards it. And then that sense of responsibility is encoded through structures, external structures of accountability. But if you drop out responsibility, that's the legal model. You've got a right story over here, something's owed something, an accountability story over here, but who is responsible for those rights is up in the air. And that seems to be historically a losing story, right? Just because something is encoded with legal rights doesn't mean it's going to be protected, because there's competing legal rights. And then you're back into a maybe brute utilitarian calculus where at some point you say, well, human needs outweigh seagrass just in terms of carbon capture versus human need. And so therefore seagrass gets plowed under. Yeah, it has rights, but the alternative is worse. The argument would go. Yeah, so the responsibility story is really important. And it seems like the Kantian, so now the philosopher in me is talking about the story that we get from somebody like Immanuel Kant about where responsibilities come from, which is the story about the nature of humans as rationally capable beings who ought to cultivate in themselves to be fully human. That kind of story, that metaphysics, seems to be gone. It's just not on our radar. Like, we don't tell a story anymore about what sort of persons we should be. And I say we because there's lots of groups across the world and in the US context who do tell those stories, right? So lots of indigenous communities across the globe, Native American indigenous communities, tell the story about their relationship to the living world. And that cultivates a different kind of ethic. Or it should, I guess. Let's be a little more careful. But yeah, that's really interesting. The right story, one of the other things I was going to say is the right story leads us into an account of autonomy. So even the right story is competing. The rights of nature compete with individual rights, which compete with community rights or collective rights. And even that story about if you think we ought to uphold something's rights, there's still a conflict among whose rights and under what conditions are going to win out. Yeah. And then that, of course, leads us back around to the question of justice, ecological, social justice concerns. Yeah. And there's lots of accounts there we can unpack.
I see a big overlap between the talk from August as well. August, which was personhood and rights, where you start assigning rights, what gets rights, and then how do you create a hierarchy among those rights, whether it's mountains, rivers, chimpanzees.
There's an older story that goes back a ways. It's kind of interesting. I've been tracking this for a long time, and I'm by no means an expert. But this had to do with the Niagara Water Bottling Company. They had wanted to increase the amount of water they pulled out of the Florida aquifer from 484,000 gallons a day to 910,000 gallons a day. And this was debated. It came up on, well, how's the water going to be used? Is it used most effectively? Well, drinking water, as I think we've decided, is the most important water, I guess, although farmers may quibble with that. But one of the things that came up is here, this water that we go to such great expense to purify for drinking is often just sprayed on lawns. So here again, that's just inefficient, ineffective use of the best water, the costliest water. Now, some of the counties, I think, have taken action, of course, to to have underground pumps that pull water up, and it's not for drinking. And you have you see the little signs that indicate don't drink this water. It is just for, for vegetation, for watering plants. But yeah, those are the kind of laws that I think are important. And of course, they went after this water bottling company, but actually water is pulled out in the same way, whether it be for beer, for soft drinks, same thing. And so the title of the article is Regulators Must Decide Who Gets Floridian Aquifers' Last Drops. But that was back in 2013, though. So there is an issue, however, I think, with problems with the other problem, of course, regarding responsibility is Florida has caught some companies simply injecting their polluted runoff water from whatever manufacturing process directly into the aquifer. Just totally irresponsible and illegal. But certainly you have to have the infrastructure in place to detect that and then to take action to prevent it.
Yeah. I feel the need to differentiate between needs and values. Because on the one hand, we've got a story about needs, competing needs. Maybe these are corporate versus community, maybe these are state versus state or individual versus individual. And competing needs is a story of, at least on my read, a story of economics. We can tell a story about how much need somebody has, what to do about it, how to evaluate competing needs. But underneath needs or alongside needs, complementary to them, is a story about values. So what sort of values are driving our need? Or if you don't like that approach, if that's too ethics heavy, what story is happening alongside the story of needs? And so we've got this story about autonomy, like the competing value of rights. We've got a story about access and equity. That's a competing story about justice. We've got a story about maybe potential harms, individual, economic, environmental. And in each of those buckets, each of those value buckets that I've laid out, there are competing interests or needs, right? Competing values. And then those buckets compete against one another as well. So the story about ethics, at least from my perspective, is always about when you're thinking about a particular case, say Lake Baringo in Kenya from the podcast, or Florida and Lake Okeechobee from the examples today, or any of the lakes in Florida or aquifers. The story is like, what is the relevant value context and who are the relevant stakeholders? And then how do you cash out? What argument can you make that one competing value set should take priority? That's different, I think, notably different than a pragmatic argument about, based on need and resource and power dynamics, what value will take priority.
Yeah, I think you need to throw in not just the human values, but also the species that also use water. We've had these huge manatee die-offs because they couldn't get enough food because of the pollution, I think, in the Indian River. Another big problem, of course, that has to do with land as well. We could actually broaden the discussion to whatever happened to the fireflies. When I was a kid growing up in Florida, we had fireflies everywhere, and now there's like one place that you can find them, and that is Blue Springs, for that 3 weeks, because all the kind of property, the soil that they use has been taken over with concrete, and they're gone. So so I think, and we are part of the web of species ourselves, and when there's die-offs of other species, it's eventually going to affect humans as well.
Yeah, at the risk of being optimistic, Stephen, which is against my very nature, I like what you've said, struck a chord, right? Because it seems like what we've faced over several generations now is a slow but important turn from humans as apart from or above nature to humans as deeply integrated in ecological webs. And maybe our policies and practices haven't quite caught up yet, but the optimist in me, for the very small part of me that is, wants to see us headed in that direction, right? That future generations of our students and our children, future UCF generations are going to see the world as more and more interconnected. And that is coming full circle now. That is that like metaphysical shift, that worldview shift that will redirect us towards a new view of what's relevant in ethics and why. Dr. Kubler, go ahead. I could rant all day.
I was going to ask you to rant some more because unless there were better or more pressing questions, I was hoping you could go deeper into the distinction that you see within the context of water between needs and values. So we talked a lot about needs, and we've in various ways said, you know, we value the environment, we value therefore clean water. But pick a subject, maybe the whole California, Colorado, Arizona area there where there's obviously needs and competing interests. Can you articulate and underscore clearly what you would see as the values that are maybe playing there? Because I want to understand some of the philosophical framing maybe a little bit better. I think we underappreciate its power.
I can certainly try. I mean, I'm with you all. I'm kind of thinking on my feet here, but so as a for instance, we mentioned California is kind of holding hostage this 7-state agreement thing. Part of that is that the value at stake is production, right? That the need, the assumed need is that everybody in the US needs to eat California agricultural products. And so we're orienting ourselves by a value of consumption towards our access to water. But on that same riverway, just to go like maybe as far to the other extreme as I can think right now, there are indigenous communities who rely on fish populations in the river that rely on certain water levels, right, for migration. And that's not necessarily need, although there is a resource bit, but it's actually a part of a worldview, right? That there's a connection between place and identity and species overlap that's essential for who those people are, who they see themselves to be. It's a deep sort of maybe a spiritual connection. That value orients their need to the same resources differently than the value of consumption orients California's, or economic production orients California's need to that same issue. And we could play that game all day, right? There's also outdoor recreation needs on the Colorado River, and that need is driven maybe by economics, but also by like aesthetic enjoyment, right? The idea that you can get out on a raft and experience the Grand Canyon through the Colorado, right? There's an aesthetic value that goes into play there. The need is the same, the need for certain water levels in the Colorado River. But the values, the three that I've laid out anyway, and there's probably endless value positions, but those two things aren't synonymous. They're the same need, but from very different value positions. And that's if you just did like a utilitarian calculus and say, okay, you know, indigenous communities, you need 12 million gallons. In California, you need 50 million gallons. I'm completely making stuff up, right? And you just say, well, that means you get 60% and you get 20% and we're done. Doesn't take into account the importance of the value distinctions and doesn't let us think through the difference. I mean, I think as an ethicist, that's where my heart lies. And Dr. Kubler, you know this as well about me, but I really like thinking about the way that values orient us to the world. And I think we don't do that enough necessarily. We get hung up in the needs calculation.
Is it helpful then in those kinds of circumstances and maybe conflicts for the parties to seek out a common shared value? I mean, maybe that sounds a little hackneyed and pedestrian, but you know, they both have, it seems like maybe some level of survival value. In the case of California, it's agricultural production. In the case of indigenous peoples and the Dene, it's their sense of identity and what that constitutes. But there's maybe a shared value in coexistence or in harmony, you know, across the border, in living in a country where you have the richness of good food production and also a historical tradition, you know, that represented in indigenous peoples that we can celebrate. Are there values like this that we might try to see that could somehow bring us toward resolutions that maybe we ignore just because, you know, they're hard, or maybe they're just too starry-eyed, I don't know, or maybe they're just challenging and in some cases intangible, you know, that's not the word, intangible, that's the word.
Intangible, yeah. No, I think some of the best ethics, the best outcome of ethics work is finding those shared values. I'll just tell you one little anecdote. A mentor of mine who passed away relatively recently, Bernie Rollins, works in animal ethics. He was at Colorado State for his whole career. And he tells lots of stories, but one of the stories he told is about early in his career, in his like professor, sport coat and jacket, whatever, going to give a talk to a bunch of ranchers. And basically he got up on stage and everybody booed him and he just stood there and he let them boo. And then he was like, wait a second, you don't even know what I'm here to talk about. So you're just booing me because of who you think I am. Let me ask you, and this is the story he's telling, would you do anything you can at any expense just to make a buck off the back of your animals? And all the ranchers were like, no way, of course. And Rollins said famously, well, then we're just bickering over price. And what he did in that moment is he found the space between an animal welfare guy, which is what he was there to talk about, and ranchers who had this like misappropriated sense of what animal welfare activism was, when in fact, he made them see they were also animal welfareists. And so then it was just about the price. And the same thing has been done around water. And this comes back to Ian's constitutional amendment story. One of the powerful tools I think that rights of nature approaches have been used for is to target value. So I could easily imagine a world in which the Colorado River gets rights because both agriculturalists in California and indigenous communities in Arizona both see the Colorado from a place of like reverence or respect. And all they're doing then is haggling about price. The Colorado River is owed reverence or respect, whatever your position might be. And respecting it requires recognizing its role in producing food, but also recognizing its role in sustaining communities. And if those two groups could get on the same value page, then I think they could talk. And there's been lots of success stories like this. I mean, the whole environmental movement in the US, I think, is a success story like that. We're slowly, over time, because of civil rights movements in the US, we came to see environment as having some kind of rights. And then it's just bickering about price, which is what basically environmental ethics is doing now. Like, what are the limits? What are the boundaries? But I'd be hard pressed to find any citizen or student now who would be like, yeah, it's just resources. We can do whatever we want with everything. I mean, we just don't live in a world like that. So now I'm just soapboxing, but is that helpful? Is that?
Yeah, it is. And I think it kind of creates parallels that I can see now with what the economist that I described was trying to do with regard to seagrass. I think he was saying something similar, that he was trying to identify a shared value for something as abstracted as seagrass, to see it as a resource that's achieving carbon capture and that we should value, and maybe even economically value and put a price to, like the cattle. I see Sterling's got something to contribute.
Yeah, Sterling, go ahead.
Hey guys, yeah, I'm kind of all over the place. I'm taking it all in and trying to emulate Dr. Kubler, because he usually waits and then he unloads this vast, profound exploratory on at the end of the meetings. But
would that were true, Sterling. You're too kind.
No, you really do. Anyway, first I was thinking just on the last thing that you said, Dr. Beaver, about animal welfare. Is anybody still familiar with Temple Grandin?
Oh yeah.
Because she was certainly involved in the slaughterhouse industry or whatever, but was trying to make things better. But
also at Colorado State. Yep.
Yeah. So one of the things I was thinking about through the whole talk was this determination of trying. So, and I'm diddling over here in the screen trying to find better facts, but yeah, we're looking at a global population that looks like the only thing they're agreeing on is it's declining, or it's going to decline. And we may have already seen the peak of the population, but then there's some sources that say 2050 is going to be the peak, and then it's going to drop after that. Looks like we had in the United States, there was a decline a couple years ago, and then now we had a year where it's increased. Who knows if people are having sex more during COVID, or even some of the migration at the southern border, it might have increased the population in the United States, but they didn't say whether it was necessarily fertility. So, and then I was going back, your original podcast was Kenya. And I can't find the article, but I found that, you know, in my lifetime, I will likely see the peak of the world's population. But rather than China or India being the most populous, they look at Nigeria as overtaking both of those, and Kenya is right there in the mix. I believe Nigeria and Chad are going to, they typically have families of, I think 7 is the average size of a family still in Nigeria. So that was one part of the thing as far as the global population goes. Locally, I was thinking of, several people have mentioned dumping stuff into the groundwater. I'm on a well, and so are all my neighbors. And Dr. Beaver, you've been by my home. 2 streets over a few years ago, a gentleman had I think it was a cleaning company, and he was dumping all his stuff in the backyard. And luckily the aquifer was east of me that got polluted. And Ian had mentioned being able to sue. That didn't happen, but the city and or county had to come in and install city water and pipes and everything up to that street where the guy had messed up everybody's aquifer. So now we're 2 streets over. I think that pretty much wraps up everything that I've said. But I think the population decline is, oh, the other point, you keep talking about the Colorado River. I've rafted in Costa Rica a few times, and they've had a situation with damming, and you're talking about people enjoying the river and everything. And I believe the river, one of the rivers that I rafted on, was completely due to damming and reservoir is completely, you know, it's not even raftable anymore. Whereas I don't think that type of attitude would be taken in the United States. I know there's some dams along the Colorado River, but as far as stopping everyone's pleasure, you know, I don't know. You see arguments over snowmobiles and avalanches and skiing and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's all I had to say.
No, that's great, Sterling. And the same thing does happen with the Colorado River. It's raftable at times and not, depending on largely on and used to be exclusively on how the dams were controlled, how much water was being pulled and from when and where. Yeah, I don't know, somebody might know better than I do, but there's a used to be a radical drop and rise in Colorado River levels because of the dams. So yeah, that's really important. We didn't really talk today yet about the podcast or Lake Baringa or Kenyan lakes. Population questions set aside, the story of that podcast is that kind of under the radar, but over a relatively short period of time, there was a radical shift in water level in Kenya. So that what was already a very lush, very wet country, like 2-kilometer moves of water over a relatively short period of time. That's partly due to human land use. It's partly due to plate shifts, tectonic plate shifts, and it's partly due to increased rainfall. So the sort of climatological changes play a really big role in how we think about resources and access and equity too. But, you know, yeah, it's just interesting that depending on where you're looking, what case you're looking at and where and what part of the world, you can either be facing a tragedy of commons resource limitation story or overabundance, which is a different kind of tragedy in its own. We talked today about rights, so the autonomy story. We talked a little bit about harms. So this goes everything from environmental and ecological harms from oysters and manatees to aquifers in Florida. We talked a little bit about the difference between rights and needs and responsibility. And we talked a little bit about justice and access. These sort of big normative themes are the sorts of themes that we're going to circle around every time we do one of these sessions together. So any final points before we sort of wrap up for today? And then I'll tell you a little bit about what's happening next month. Stephen, yeah, please.
Yeah, the Kenya article was really interesting. And one of the points they made is that the local politicians, the local government just kind of ignored the problem until it looked like maybe the United Nations had an interest and maybe they could get some money for, bring money in. other than that, they just ignored it. And I was thinking the same thing, remember in 2014 when here in Florida, we passed Amendment 1. Amendment 1, the whole idea was to use some kind of a real estate tax to protect the environment, to buy land, all of those sorts of things.
Yeah.
And then Governor Scott used it he did some of it, he used some of it properly, but then others was used for other things. The same thing with the lottery. It's all supposed to go for education. And then of course, no, it really didn't. So yeah, making sure that when you pass a bill that's for environment, for water use and protecting survivability, sustainability of our resources, we need to stay on our politicians to make sure it goes for the use that it was supposed to go for. So yeah, that was a good article, and Ken appreciated that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting story. And I like that we've kept things more or less local today too, because there's a lot going on just in our home state that is directly relevant to this kind of story. And it'll be relevant to what we're talking about in February too, when we're talking about wealth and inequality. There's been a big push recently by wealthy people for wealth taxes, and that yet hasn't come to bear. And so we should talk a little bit about resource distribution of that kind. We'll do that in our next session together. But thank you, friends. You're welcome to invite anybody you'd like to these sessions in the future. Feel free to spread the word. I will edit this lightly and then get it up on YouTube so we can review the conversation. Ian, you asked if we've got any sort of works, publications on rights and responsibilities. Yeah, I'm sure we can. There's a zillion things you could read. I would say the first place to direct you would be to John Rawls, his Theory of Justice, which you might know already. Rawls has a really interesting position on justice as fairness, and it's a very famous account that's driven a lot of US policy. So you might start there, and then we can circle back around next session and talk more. But I could give you a million things to read. So send me a note by email. You can reach us at Center for Ethics at UCF.edu or my email address. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. This has been fun as always. We'll see you next time.